continuing with the theme of justice, and in the 8th Arcanum, I'm going now to this teaching in the Holy Book of Thoth by Vladimir Shmakov. It's very long, so I'll cut out some of the sort of visual descriptions of the cards, for example, so that we can get through this Arcanum and I don't lose anybody. It shares the same associations of liberatio, karma, themis, justice, the law, and of course the Hebrew alphabet letter is Chet for the 8th Arcanum. The number is 8. He begins with the laws of the world above and the laws of the world of being. The law of nature is essentially different in its very nature from the law of the higher world. Every law of the higher world as an absolute principle is a complete system, extended from the atom to the higher syntheses. It is perfect and there is no movement in it, for it contains in its own being all the infinitely diverse possibilities of all movement. As Vladimir Shmakov says, excuse me, everything is done according to immutable laws, but in different spheres of existence it is obvious that heterogeneous laws, or more precisely, different applications of the same law, must prevail, and from this heterogeneity naturally follows a different relationship of these particular laws, so that laws of a lower order can appear as subordinate to the laws of a higher order, just as, admitting specific differences between the world forces, we have the right to admit a different relationship between them, to admit the existence of higher and more powerful forces capable of subjugating others. Another reference is from Spinoza. If we now turn our attention to the nature of the natural divine law, we will see that it is universal, or common to all men, for we have derived it from the nature of man in general. The law of nature is only a particular section of the law of the upper world. Every law of nature is a concretely taken system of inferences or relationships relating to a conditionally accepted plane of time, the principle of relativity, and relating to a certain conditional world which is constructed by the human consciousness as follows. A number of so-called ideal phenomena are taken in their plane, that is, at a given moment of time, and therefore of special position. A certain system of relations is observed. This system, without taking into account either the distortion by the imperfection of our consciousness, or the fact that it refers to ideal phenomena, and not to such as they are in reality, is taken as absolute. Then it spreads through the third dimension by identity and not by analogy. Another quote from Carpenter. The method of science is the method of every possible knowledge of the universe by man. This is the method of deliberate limitation or inner ignorance. Seeing before us the great all-encompassing unity of nature, we can only mentally understand it by selecting some details and intentionally or unconsciously isolating them from the rest. The laws of the upper world constitute the inner essence and the true foundation of all natural phenomena. They are the only ones who can add and do and give answers to questions about the nature of phenomena, their absolute value and reality. The so-called laws of nature are in themselves objects of this nature, are contained in its general economy, and therefore, being its factors, only higher than the factors of individual phenomena, are subject to change like them and cannot serve as a source from which man can draw true, perfect, and absolute knowledge. If he wants to perceive it, he must turn his spirit to comprehend the absolute laws that lie above all concrete concepts, and which are the true substances or aspects of the supreme first cause. As Leibniz says, When I was looking for the last causes of mechanism and laws, even of motion, I was amazed to the last degree to see that they could not be found in the field of mathematics, and that it was necessary to return to metaphysics. Any law of positive science can serve as an example of the above, since each of them is valid only in some particular case. By extending it to others, we will make more and more mistakes, and finally arrive at absurdity and contradiction, both with a priori evidence and with concrete observations. And then he refers to, for example, the Boyle-Marriott law, saying it's completely unfair when the ratio between, I'm going to just skip the maths. Okay. He says this is not only true in the physical and chemical world, but also the sciences of pure reason. The laws of living force, the parallelogram of forces, impact, and even the addition of velocities themselves are completely unfair at a speed close to the speed of light. He says it's noteworthy that now it is humanity experiencing the era of the development of consciousness about the evolution of the laws of nature. This would have been in the 1920s, and their only relative value. Einstein's theory of the principle of relativity will undoubtedly form the cornerstone of the entire future edifice of science, the science of living nature as it really is, and not the dead invented by people. The exceptions to the laws are gradually being brought under the law themselves. So every law of nature is essentially relative, and therefore in essence, these relations are completely wrongly called the laws of nature, because the laws known to people are only the laws of their own thinking, their perceptions, the techniques of their conclusion, and not the ratio scripta of nature. Back to Carpenter, who says, thus the attempt to give the phenomenal world an explanation in itself reliable, regardless of the state of the minds of the people who proposed it, must necessarily end in failure. The laws of nature, real, true, and absolute, are the laws of the world above, of the world of causes. They are absolute to every mind, to every perception. They contain everything in themselves, and there is nothing outside them. Just turn off my email. So having looked at the laws of the world above and the world of being, it goes to the laws of the universe, on the individual and super-individual laws of nature. Quoting again Leibniz, each individual is a small world, a microcosm, and we understand this small world only because of the inner connection between its laws and the laws of the larger world, or worlds to which it belongs. Every human being in the world of being, generated by the Atman, carries two elements. On the one hand, it is a microcosm, that is, the whole world, independently existing in itself, and on the other hand, it is a part of the macrocosm. The Atman itself is a part of the whole, and a whole in part. This duality is the primary source of the simultaneous existence of macrocosmicity and microcosmicity in the whole human being. The whole cosmos is simultaneously on the one hand integral and undivided, and on the other hand consists of an innumerable number of separate individuals. Hence it is clear that the laws of the cosmos must be simultaneously in two aspects, in one as impersonal, and in the other as a complex of separate aspects applied to individual individuals. The system of impersonal laws I will call the law of the cosmos. The second system I will call the laws of karma. The laws of the cosmos, or macrocosmic laws, that is, the impersonal laws, speak about the binary of these two systems. Everything is in me, and I am in everything. Opportunity is the trajectory of the movement of one or a combination of several impulses, phenomena, ideas or events in space or time. As a result of granting all the active factors freedom of influence according to the general laws of nature. The human spirit, as a part of the deity, lies outside the world, for, drawing strength from itself, it can by its power interfere with the course of cause and effect and translate the desired phenomenon into another possibility. The system of impersonal laws of nature and the world system of possibilities are concepts that are equivalent and treated the same thing. Indeed, the direction, form, appearance, ramifications, modes, junctions, intersections, coincidences, and combinations of lines of possibility are nothing but the spatial interpretation of causal dependencies, effects, correlations, mutual strengthening or mutual weakening of systems of laws of the cosmos. Hence it is clear that the concept of the laws of the cosmos, the laws of the impersonal, appears to be transcendental. In the world we see and know only individuals, their mutual relations, their states and changes, and therefore all that we directly see and are aware of cannot directly lead us to the knowledge of the general world laws. Nevertheless, with every new perception, we always have the opportunity to separate the tonalities inherent in the world and the plane in which this our knowledge occurs, and thus reveal in consciousness a certain abstract system. This latter is an element of the general law. We also have the opportunity to approach the system of impersonal laws of nature based on the principles of the world above. These principles, being intuitively perceived, are revealed in our consciousness in the form of some a priori conclusions, and it is the ability to identify them in the intellect that is the measure and indicator of the reality of perception and the ability to use this perception in future. Each absolute law contains not only its own dogma and its justification, but also the whole complex of all the ways in which the realization of the principle in the phenomenal world proceeds, as well as the comprehension of this entire system by the evolutionary consciousness. A person can only say that he has perceived the law of the universe when he has not only projected its expression into his consciousness, but has also understood both the principles of its existence and the course of its consequences, that is, how this law fulfills its mission in the general economy of nature. As Spinoza says, if people understood the whole order of things with complete clarity, they would find everything as necessary as the provisions of mathematics. But since this exceeds the measure of their knowledge, they consider some things only possible and not necessary. He quotes as well Stanley Jevons. The universe in which we live is not the result of chance, and if it seems to us that chance is at work anywhere, it is due to the imperfection of our faculties, which prevents us from recognizing the actions of the law. The latter is rarely realized by man, and therefore the vast number of laws known to him remains, in his eyes, only a code established by an irresistible force, but not directly derived from reason. The reason for this phenomenon lies in the very essence of the so-called laws of nature. Any relation between a certain complex of objects, taken as such and considered abstractly outside of the particular case where it was observed, is only a conditional system of inferences. On the other hand, these constructions are always adapted to the case when all objects are not what they really are, but are presented as ideal. In other words, the laws and relations known to man always refer to some imaginary world which has only a greater or lesser affinity with the real world. The above is a natural consequence of the immeasurable complexity of the phenomena of the universe and the resulting need. Need to classify them in one way or another. If a person always found an absolutely reasonable system of classification, then he should not lose sight of the fact that, passing to the world of overtones, that is, differential particulars, he would have to apply the laws of the intellectual world to the real world of analogy, and not by identity. In fact, an absolutely reasonable system of classification is unattainable for him, because he must classify before he perceives the law, and therefore he is condemned to pursue a goal unknown to himself. And so, having before him the infinite diversity of the universe, a person begins to classify according to certain mottos in groups of particular ones, consciously rejecting, without taking into account at all, the differences in the members of the same group. Meanwhile, it may turn out, as always happens in reality, that he creates a system of mottos based on signs that had only a particular concrete meaning and not on the keys that really characterize groups of an absolutely reasonable system. As Bartholomew says, false ideas are like the wrong stones that can't be used to build a building. All of the above boils down to the fact that a person, due to the imperfection of his consciousness, approaches the relations of the intellectual world from the wrong angle of view, and therefore does not perceive the law as such, but always only its projection on some completely conventional plane. That is why it is so difficult for a person to study any law of nature in its entirety. If man were condemned forever to go from particulars to the general, then his knowledge of the external world would proceed with tremendous slowness, and even in the end would stop altogether, because human life is too short to know with the mind all the vast innumerable differential particulars, conclusions necessary for the knowledge of the general principle on the highest plane. Ah yes, life is too short. The divinity of the spirit of man is reflected in the fact that he can equally know from below and from above, and therefore the whole purpose of his mental activity must be directed to link from above, and therefore, and link together these cognitions. With the help of intuition, man anticipates principles that he would never have reached with the slow, painstaking work of his lower side. It is these principles that reveal a new world to man, and his task of connecting the higher with the lower is immeasurably easier. He collects particulars, classifies them no longer by repeated experiments, but in the light of finite principle, which he must approach based on the lower. But here too his work is truly grandiose. So we can really approach the system of super-individual laws both from below and from above. In the first case, through the synthesis of the known a posteriori, in the second, through the construction of analogues of the principles of the high world. These two methods are not fully valid and equivalent. Indeed, in any synthesis we always include in our work our strength, the energy of our thinking. We can say that all work from the particular to the general is essentially vampiric, because we only expend force on it and are able to reveal the principle in a tangible way only when in fact our previous work has already previously revealed it semi-consciously. On the contrary, any work with the help of intuition itself makes our work easier. Yes, easier to understand within ourselves, but not necessarily easier to convey to others. That's where you need to be able to reason it through. Each common intuitive principle, like a true pentacle, is in itself an inexhaustible source of the power of thinking, shaping, associating, projecting, and imprinting. The more a person works with the help of intuition, the stronger he becomes intellectually. Such work does not tire him at all, for not only does it not require mental fluids from him, but it itself generates the most powerful vibrations, which by their power energize the brain of the researcher and help him to increase the amount of mental energy potentially contained by him. This is why every positive work in its very essence has its limit when it has exhausted the powers of its author. On the contrary, intuitive work can have no limit in this respect, but it puts it in another. When a person becomes too strong, his vibration is too thinned. His material body is unable to hold these vibrations any longer, and death occurs not from lack of power, but from excess of it. Thus we come to the conclusion that the system of impersonal laws of the cosmos is essentially divided into two groups. Some laws are active in relation to a person and endow him with their power, whilst others are passive and vampiric in relation to his mind. Man, following the path of his evolution, must simultaneously comprehend both those and others. That is why it is the link in the universe. That is why to know is to neutralize. These two groups merge in the great binary of the principles of all cognition, all initiation, of which Arcanum VIII speaks. So now I know why they were getting me to read this. Why they were coming to me and saying you must read the 8th Arcanum, because we've been doing so much about binaries. Two people represent these two initiations. One red, this is the side of the human soul, the power of which is increasing, the elements of fire and earth. He always perceives power and always grows immeasurably, increasing his power. The other figure, the black figure, is the side of the human soul that must always give, that must always receive power from the active side of the soul, which is itself deprived of freedom, and the person's hands are tied behind. So you think, yeah, he's referring to, I think, the image on the fifth arcanum here, which in principle can be given insofar as the other side provides it with his power. His elements are water and air. Air is the emblem of division and classification, the emblem of cognition from below. Water is the possibility that he must realize by this cognition. These two sides of the human soul, these two faculties of cognition, intuition and reason, live inseparably, and each always follows its own path. Red is always red, black is always black. Each of them fulfills its own mission, and both of them together carry out the movement of man eternally forward, toward the union of heaven with earth, great with small, higher with lower, external with internal, to reach the realm of eternal knowledge and eternal truth. Now, I'm not going to read the whole arcanum because this is so dense, isn't it? But I will read the next section, which is the laws of karma, or microcosmic, that is, personal laws. He's going to quote from Otto Weininger. Man is one and all, and therefore he contains the law in himself, therefore he is the law itself, and not an arbitrary one. He demands that this law be strictly observed in him. He wants to be only the law, without looking back and looking to the future. There is something stunningly grand about this. There is no longer the meaning for which he obeys the laws. There is no supreme authority over him alone. He must follow the categorical imperative contained in him, inexorable, not allowing any transaction with himself. Another phrase from ancient wisdom. That's all he says about that. Man has been searching for millennia in the superstellar world for the lawgiver who lives in his heart. Beautiful. The lawgiver who lives in his heart. Turning to the question of individuality and to the laws of the microcosm, we must first say that every problem in this field inherently carries an element of time, which is revealed in the principles of causality, sequences and movements in general. Indeed, if we consider this being of the whole man in all his fullness at the same time on the path of his whole life, we will no longer have before us a microcosm, but a macrocosm, since it contains all the elements and all the stages of the cosmos as a whole. It is clear that the latter is a simple logical consequence of the general principles that every human being is both Adam Kadmon and an element, and that when we move from the macrocosm to the whole microcosm, we only change the absolute scale, but not the very essence of the problem we are considering. Thus we have quite logically come to the conclusion that every problem about a person must be considered in time, and that this latter arises not from the properties of the technique of our perceptions, but from the very essence of the question. In other words, in this case, the element of time is absolute, but only in the sense that only the principle of time is absolute and not its scale. This is the main difference between the entire second arcanum septurna and the first septurna, which lies completely outside the principle of time. So the first septurna, first 7 arcana. The life of man is synonymous with the concept of his movement. His consciousness is forever moving, forever passing through one section of the world after another, forever generating new phenomena and perceiving the reflections of new noumenons. As one goes along one's path, one encounters more and more particular laws, and in the end, each integral superpersonal law of the cosmos, a reflection of the principles of the higher world, is translated into one's being in its entirety. A quote from Herder: "The growing tree, the aspiring man, must pass through various ages, and all of them clearly represent a forward movement, one aspiration after another without interruption. However, this is an eternal aspiration. No one is alone in his age. Everyone builds on the past. The past is nothing but the foundation of the future, and can be nothing else. This is evidenced by the analogy in nature, the speaking prototype of God in all creatures. Every idea that a person knows does not remain inert, but living in his being. Dynamically, it affects all his other sides and imposes its individual imprint on everything that he knows." Yeah, and just remember the ternary of time, where we have the past and the future, that binary neutralized by the present, divine providence, fate, and the will of man neutralized by providence. Now then, the next section, going deeper. Do I carry on? The title of the next section is Breathing, Pulsation and Consciousness. Let's give a little bit before I get too exhausted. Quote from Carp: "God created the universe from a single center. The emanation goes from the center to the periphery. The various stages of the emanation are distributed as concentric circles." Sounds like Dante, doesn't it? "Every movement is projected into our consciousness, and absolutely in the form of a spiral movement, generated by pulsation, this true fundamental principle of all movement." And of course, Valentin Tomberg writes about the living spiral, doesn't he? As against the closed circle. Got to keep things moving. Each spiral starts from a point, develops to a certain value, then contracts again to a point, which forms a complete cycle of pulsation. Every movement has a self-sufficient force as its primary basis and source. The source of all power in the human being is Atman, but it is itself immobile, and therefore there must exist in man an independent principle of movement, which at the same time is an integral category of the Atman. If the Atman did not contain the categories of motion, there could be no motion in the world. For each Atman generates this being of man and the universal totality of such creations in the world itself. The deity is immobile, but he is the source and originator of all movement, and all this movement, like the world itself, comes out of its depth to return to it again. The Atman, as an analogue of the deity, knows itself through the identification of the whole being of man and as reverse absorption. This pulsation was called the human breath by Hindus. As the world is the breath of God, so the man of being is the result of the breath of the septurna of his ear. Gosh, the ear principle. Yeah, I remember this now. Goodness gracious. This doctrine that all life is the result of breathing, an ocean of repeated manifestations and contractions that merge into a single cosmic breath, runs like a thread through all initiations of all times and all peoples. One of the most famous monuments of literature in India is the Mahabharata. The word Bharata in Sanskrit means breath of life. I was going to give more examples. For example, from the Book of the Dead, or actually its proper title is the Book of the Master of Hidden Places. They live by the breaths of the other world. And to confirm this, a quote from Moray: "Life was for the Egyptians something difficult to define. We would say it was a vibration. For them it was a breath or a fluid." The teachings of the ancient Egyptians about Thoth as the god of the wind, the breath of life, are described in detail by Edouard Naville. To give breath is to give life. As Maspero says, To revive the mummy, a veil is brought to its nostrils, which produces a breath of wind. And from the Book of Breaths, Shane Sin Sin. One of the ritual books that provides for the resurrection from the dead is called the Book of Breaths. The consciousness of man is the point to which the breath of Eo reaches. The breath lives eternally. The consciousness moves eternally. The man of the earth can never rise beyond the physical consciousness. Because of this, the following aspect of the square pentacle of Arcanum VII will be quite absolute for us. In the plane of Adi there will be physical Ea. In the plane of Anapadaka there will be the same Ea plus its projection in this world. In the plane of Atma, Ea and its projections into the worlds of Anapadaka, Atma, and etc. The worlds on this pentacle are coordinated by consciousness but not by its being, but by the appearance of those attributes through which it is revealed, that is, by their freedom and constraints. Thus the consciousness of the physical world differs from the consciousness of the astral world, only in that in one case it is based on the laws and phenomena of the physical world, and in the other on the laws and phenomena of the astral world, projected into the physical consciousness. In a particular case, for example, the concept of time for the physical world has a very real scale. A person cannot change it, because the scale lies outside of it. On the contrary, in the consciousness lies outside of it. On the contrary, in the consciousness of the astral world, time exists, but only as such, as a certain abstract principle, known in a sequence of states of movements, but its scale is completely conditional. And even more, a person can perceive movement in a mirror, i.e. in the opposite direction to what it would be in the physical world. So we see Shmakov is really rising through the planes with what he's telling us here. Similarly, by analogy, we can construct all further distinctions of consciousness, which all, however, follow from the general principle of consciousness of the physical world. The life of the Atman, its breath, for the physical consciousness is absolutely expressed in the fact that the plane of consciousness fluctuates in a vertical direction. Moreover, everything that lies above consciousness before the Atman has a real existence. Everything that lies below consciousness has an existence only in possibility. The amplitude of the oscillation of consciousness is a variable value and increases more and more as it develops. At the first stages of evolution, consciousness has never yet gone beyond the physical world, and therefore there is no consciousness in it, as it is commonly understood, but only automatic properties and reflexive responses to any action that comes from outside. This state corresponds to the amorphous state of matter, as for example in cosmic gas clusters and nebulae. As evolution progresses, the amplitude of the oscillation of consciousness increases. Consciousness partially captures the astral regions. The first glimpses of intelligence appear. Crystals are born. Then consciousness reaches the edge of the mental. The vegetable kingdom appears. Then the animal world is born to the limits of the buddhi, and only with the achievement of the fourth world is man born, and the spirit in its pure form is first projected. But man has yet to live indefinitely, to work for a long time, until consciousness reaches the limits of Ea, is projected entirely. Man will reach the physical world for the last time, and will incarnate on earth for the last time as a great initiate. For in him the pure spirit of the eternal light will be projected, and at this time he will truly be good. After this, voluntarily dying, he acquires that excess of power which will transfer his consciousness beyond the physical Ea, dissolve it in itself, and finally leave the physical world. The immortal life of man is divided into the lives of man on earth and into sojourns in space by the action of the pulsation of the physical Ea. The breath of Ea sometimes carries consciousness into the physical world, and then a person is born on earth. Sometimes it rises again, a person dies here, and is born for new life in new worlds. Consciousness is a noumenon in relation to its phenomenal states. It cannot, in its very essence, decrease, for it is the result of the experience of previous work, and therefore it is constantly increasing, growing, and relying on more and more new data obtained by human life. But at the same time, not to mention the period of childhood and old age, when consciousness is revealed less than in the prime of a person's life, it even changes greatly for a short time, sometimes increasing, sometimes decreasing. In this way, we naturally came to a new element of the life of a human being, to consciousness, by which I mean the degree of perfection of projecting the consciousness of a complete person into consciousness at the moment. From the point of view of the earthly man, the degree of his consciousness is expressed by a continuous curve obtained from the sinusoid. Okay, I'm not going to... Okay, if you remove the parts of the curve that lie below the axis because they relate to the periods between incarnated states when consciousness is not projected into the physical world at all, looking at the individual life of a person, we always see that the person, starting from zero, develops to a certain critical point, after which he again begins to decline. Hence it is clear that the full consciousness of the incarnated person, which is characteristic of this incarnation, is only for the moment when he experiences his culmination. This moment is exactly when the plane of consciousness, which descended down into the physical world, turns back again and rushes up. So consciousness and consciousness are in a simple relationship. Consciousness is derivative of consciousness in time, the course of which, according to the principle of relativity, must be taken on the scale of the movement of the plane of consciousness in the whole person. I mean, we all have those eureka moments, don't we? Shall we just boil that a little bit down to that, so we don't get lost? The consciousness of man is the cognition of himself through his reflections, the totality of which, that is, the composition in the tradition, is called the adira of the world to which Ea belongs. When we call the Atman consciousness the divine consciousness, we will call this, right, okay, no, that's going to be too difficult to read out. I'll praise of this last bit. The whole being of man has 7 worlds, coordinated by his consciousness, of which only the lowest part of this being is accessible to our study. It talks about the 7-dimensional parts of this world, determined by certain constraints. Okay, I'm not going to do that. And then he goes on to talk about metempsychosis, reincarnation. I'm not going to read any further. I'll just give the quote to end from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 8. I am the unharmed and supreme Brahma, in the inner nature, Adhyatma. I am the supreme spirit, the soul of all souls in the world, and that which flows out of me, the cause of all existences in the world, is karma.